The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily represent those of any organization, including One Generation Away.
America is free. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of enterprise, and freedom is special and rare.
This is Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides, a production of LibertyNation.com, going after what the politicians really mean and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
You don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows, so said legendary singer-songwriter Bob Dylan. And the very same holds true for the dangerous direction the United States seems to be drifting towards. Censorship is coming fast and furious, inflation set to rocket, perhaps even here to stay. And the formerly great and good embracing the Cuban regime and praising communism even as they receive a paycheck for being lawmakers in a democracy. We can see the signs, the road markings are clear, and indeed, that particular wind is blowing harder and harder. But will the answers come along with it? Welcome to Liberty Nation Radio, right here on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides, and we have an action-packed show for you today. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news and analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and fondness for the great American Constitution. On today's episode, we'll be speaking with constitutional lawyer Scott D.Cosenza to examine just what aspects of the Constitution and your liberties are on the politically expedient chopping block. Author and podcaster Jeff Charles will be sitting in to figure out why nobody wanted to mention that Black Lives Matter was a self-avowed Marxist organization from the very start. Also, we'll have the hottest takes on the infamous inflation debacle that so many in government and media refuse to take seriously. And finally, we'll be chatting with author Jim Fite to discuss Joe Biden's plan to utilize private companies to fulfill governmental propaganda. How does this all fit in with the First Amendment, if at all? And what are the latest developments? All this and a whole lot more on today's edition of Liberty Nation Radio. One of the most notable events of the last couple of weeks was not that folks in Cuba were protesting against the communist government, but that of the reaction to the protests, and indeed the regime from within American borders. We saw marches in solidarity with the Cuban people down in Miami, and some heavy-hitting politicos voiced their support for those who live under the despotic regime. But some factions seem to be far more supportive than another. And the question is, I'm sure we all want answered, is why do prominent groups within the USA support communism even as they pretend to fight for democracy? To help us with this conundrum, we're joined by Liberty Nation author and podcast host, Mr. Jeff Charles. Welcome, Jeff.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Thanks for being here. Now, tell me, Jeff, Black Lives Matter received a lot of pushback for seemingly supporting the Cuban regime. Now, I presume this was the national organization, but what did they say?
Well, they released a statement which was exceedingly dishonest, but not surprising. The Global Black Lives Matter organization is Marxist, and they have freely admitted this. And the statement essentially defended the Cuban regime, which has been oppressing its citizens for decades. And they blamed the problems that the Cuban people face, the people on the ground. They blamed their problems on the United States because of our economic embargo. And then they also went on about how the Cuban regime has always been about fighting racism and how they've stood in solidarity with Black Americans, which is also a lie. So
have they met Che Guevara?
Yeah. Che Guevara was very much a racist, and Fidel Castro wasn't much better. I mean, he essentially outlawed conversations on race and people who were fighting for civil rights. You can get exiled or imprisoned for doing that under Fidel Castro. So
or your Twitter account shut down.
Comment.
Right. I mean, for those of us who have read the literature on Black Lives Matter, the global organization, and listened to the founders talk about being trained Marxists, this really shouldn't come as a shock that they're supportive of this regime. So why is everyone so surprised in the mainstream media? Why are they running these shock horror stories that BLM supports the Cuban regime?
Yeah, well, I mean, the media isn't surprised. They're pretending. I mean, they cover this stuff, so they know.
Pearl clutching false surprise, yes.
Right, exactly. So, but I think people outside of the media who are surprised precisely because the media didn't really want to cover this aspect of Black Lives Matter. So to people who don't know what they're about, this does come as a surprise because the media didn't really do their due diligence and report on all aspects of the organization.
I mean, it does seem quite strange that for over a year now, almost 2 years now, they've been talking about how the nuclear family's got to go. This form of government isn't working, but that's not what we hear in the media, is it? That's not the story that's portrayed. We're told that, well, it's about police brutality, which many of the things were, especially, and you make some great distinctions on this in some of your writing on libertynation.com, Jeff, that a lot of actual good stuff has been done by local chapters, but it's really the overarching global brand that's it's sucked up almost $1 billion and not done a single thing for a black person in America, as far as I can tell. Or please tell me if I'm wrong.
Well, no, I mean, they really haven't. And the local chapters are different. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't Marxists in some of the local chapters. I mean, it depends on basically on geography and where it is. So there would still be disagreements that they would have with conservatives. But at the same time, their agenda isn't necessarily as Marxist as the global or national organization. And these people are actually trying to do good work on the ground. Some, you get varying results. But I think that the global organization sucks all of the air out of the room. They get the most attention because they're in front of the camera more often. So that's why you're seeing this kind of this disconnect between what the global Black Lives Matter organization really is and what people perceive it to be.
Yeah, I think many of the people who marched with Black Lives Matter last year and, of course, the beginning of this year might just, in fact, be surprised that what they're marching under a banner that really does support a communist regime 90 miles off the coast of America, and it should be quite troubling for some, I'd imagine. Now, it does make one wonder, especially in terms of the leading politicians in the country, if those people who have supported Black Lives Matter openly in the news media, in their stump speeches, perhaps they have sympathies with communist or socialist governments. I mean, we've certainly seen Bernie Sanders is very, very much let's call him a socialist because he's only on the stepping stone there. But your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think as far as high profile individuals on the left who are supporting Black Lives Matter, they are very much in line with the type of government that is over the Cuban people. At least some of them are. I mean, like you brought up Bernie Sanders. I mean, you have other people like Michael Moore, who did a whole documentary on how great Cuba's healthcare is. But I think the rest, I mean, especially among the rank and file, I mean, most of their funding does come from white progressives. And these are white progressives who genuinely want to help. They don't know anything about the communists and the socialist aspect of the organization. They've just been sold a bill of goods saying, hey, we're actually trying to help Black people. Black people are suffering, yada, yada, yada. Give your money to us and we will do things that benefit the Black community. And then they end up not doing anything and the local chapters end up complaining about it. So I think the people who are prominent, they know what's going on and they have an agenda, whereas others may not necessarily be aware of what Black Lives Matter really is.
Now, Jeff, I'm going to paraphrase a little, twist the line from the movie The Usual Suspects. The greatest trick the Democrats ever played was convincing voters that democratic socialism was not socialism. Your thoughts?
Well, I think overall that hasn't succeeded. But when it comes to younger voters, they're making inroads. When it comes to Gen Z and that age group, they are persuading them. And they have even had success with persuading young Republicans to favor capitalism less than they did previously. Andrew Moran did an article on this. So, yeah, I think they are playing the game fairly well, but they're looking at the long game. That's why they're focusing on the youth and not so much people in our age range, even though, we're still strapping young lads.
Absolutely, we are. Jeff Charles, my thanks to you. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And we'll be right back after this short break on Liberty Nation Radio.
For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
The specter of prolonged inflation is looming over the United States. Just a few short months ago, the American people were assured that there would be no inflation. Then that was backtracked to include a merely transitionary inflation, or transitory, in fact. And now we have inflation with us and likely to stay for the foreseeable future. How is this going to impact savers and investors? And what shape can we expect the economy to be in as the 2022 midterms approach? Helping us find the answer is Liberty Nation's economic correspondent, Andrew Moran. Welcome, Andrew. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Now tell me, Andrew, what is the situation with inflation right now? What are the numbers?
Not good.
Succinct. Thank you very much. We'll be right back. Oh, no. Do you have any more information for us, Andrew?
Yeah, so the annual inflation rate is at 5.4%. It has been this high in 13 years. Producer prices have topped 7%. This is how much it costs to produce things. That's also at 11-year high. The University of Michigan's consumer inflation expectations is at approaching 5%. A recent Wall Street survey even found that investors think that higher inflation will be here to stay for another year. So overall, life is becoming too expensive for most Americans these days, and there's no respite in sight. Everyone still thinks that inflation is here, except for many of the Washington power brokers.
Okay, now, how can we expect this to continue? You mentioned that Wall Street expects it to last for up to a year. So what measures are the government taking at the moment? Or are they taking any measures? Are they just assuming that it will go away at some point, or at least not be reported on by the media?
I think they're taking an approach of, please stop, please let inflation just wind down, don't come anymore. So they're not preparing for anything. At the same time, there really isn't there's not anything that they can do. The Federal Reserve has already said that they're not raising interest rates for another 2 to 3 years. They'll probably delay that because they're worried about hurting the economy if they do pull the trigger on a rate hike. The federal government are still planning to spend trillions of dollars more on top of the $4 or $5 trillion the government already spends. So they're not preparing for anything. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said rapid inflation is here to stay for several more months. And then even from a market standpoint, which is also contributing to the higher prices, these higher commodity prices, whether it's energy or agriculture, there's something the government can do about it. You have weather playing a factor, taxes in foreign countries, speculation of investors, output, supply and demand. You could take the China route and say that you're clamping down on the commodities market, but that would be egregious for a market-oriented economy such as the United States to even take such a route.
Okay, and how does this, let's call it an alleged Washington blip, how does it impact those who have money saved in the bank or money to invest? How is it affecting the average American?
Yeah, well, so this hurts savers because now the money that they set aside for all these years, it purchases less. It's a challenge for most of the retirees who live on their savings. I was reading a report on CNBC the other day talking about many American retirees. They're losing sleep because the money that they set aside plus the Social Security benefits they have, it's not keeping up with the rate of inflation. But overall, I think it's something that everybody should be concerned about, whether you're unemployed or you're a student or you're middle-aged or you have a family, because now your dollars, or in your case, the British pounds, they're buying less as time goes by. At this point, your only option is to invest your money, which can be risky for a lot of investors because, whether they don't have enough experience or, the risk tolerance is as low as it is. But at the same time, your only alternative is to invest. If you want to beat the rate of inflation, you'll need to find a stock that pays a dividend, or you need to leap into an index fund like the S&P 500, because then that will at least generate annual double-digit returns and hopefully beat today's rate of inflation, which is around 5, 6, 7%. And some even say that rate is even higher. Like if you go to John Williams' shadow stats, he'll say that inflation is actually 10% because of the way the government's measures inflation. So overall, this is one of the reasons why interest rates are suppressed because the central banks, they nudge people into the stock market with these low rates. But which is interesting, if I may, if you look at Sweden, when they had sub-zero interest rates, the central bank at the time, the Riksbank, they said that, we have sub-zero interest rates, so people are now going to start investing their money. But it turned out it had the opposite effect because the unintended consequence was people are fearful when you have negative rates that an economic downturn is going to happen or a recession is going to occur. So these people were putting their money in their microwaves and under their mattress. Seriously, too. I'm not kidding.
So was all of this inevitable, Andrew? I mean, you were warning about it since well before the Fed realized on the pages of libertynation.com. I mean, what were the warning signs and why were they ignored?
Yeah, well, yeah, I was on the Uprising podcast last spring talking to Scott D.Cosenza, the host of the show, talking about the inflation bomb and the inflation tsunami. And, all of this was widely expected. I don't know how anyone at the Fed or the White House, whether it was the Trump administration or the Biden administration, could not see this coming. When you create 1/4 of all U.S. dollars ever printed in U.S. history in less than a year, you're going to have this massive inflation. Plus, I also had the benefit of monitoring the markets of what was going on because I also write about commodities and foreign exchange. So we look at the copper market, for example, there was a coming supply deficit. So when you have all these governments clamoring for copper at the same time to stimulate their economies, build infrastructure, you're going to have this massive run on copper prices. So if you comb through the data, it's common sense at that point that you're going to have inflation. So I think, as I alluded to before, I think all these policymakers we're just burying their heads in the sand and they're hoping for this whole thing to just blow over.
I mean, we've long heard the adage when it comes to elections, it's the economy stupid. Now, how do you see the present situation, foreseeable as it may have been, impacting the results of the 2022 midterms?
Yeah, I think President Biden, he's absolutely concerned about the inflation threat. He had a press conference recently targeting these inflation concerns among consumers. But at the same time, he pulled this incredible mental gymnastics talking about how his $4.5 trillion spending bill will somehow curb inflation. How out to lunch you have to be to think this will actually cure inflation. But overall, the Republicans, they're pouncing on this with just a year to go into the midterm elections. Mitch McConnell, he recently accused the Democrats of spending their way out of inflation, which is hilarious because what did the Republicans do for the last 4 years? They spent, but that's another story. Many polls have highlighted among the Americans that inflation is their primary economic concern more than unemployment. I guess you'll be seeing Republicans and Democrats hit the F5 button on their browsers to get the latest inflation data on those days that the consumer and producer price indexes are released.
All right. And are we likely to see any short-term corrective measures to give the country an economic boost other than spending $4 trillion or at least the appearance of one as voters head to the polls?
Wait, you just answered your own question. Yeah, they're gonna be spending more to try to help consumers fight the inflation. The Federal Reserve, they've said that they're going to keep their foot on the pedal. They're going to continue with the $125 billion monthly bond purchases. They're not raising rates anytime soon. President Biden, he has signaled that he's going to cut spending anytime soon. The only thing that I think is going to happen is the administration with many of the Democrats, they're going to sign off on another fourth stimulus check. That's something Democrats have been clamoring for the last several months. They want another $1,200 stimulus check. Some even want a perpetual stimulus check until the pandemic is officially over, which, according to Fauci, that'll never be the case. So their only corrective measure they're going to employ is more spending because they think that, consumers are dealing with higher prices. So, of course, we have to give them a handout and start giving them more money. But what they should be doing instead is just raising interest rates, cut spending, and then you'll solve a lot of the inflation going on right now.
Andrew Moran, the potential next head of the Federal Reserve. Who knows? Many thanks to you, Andrew.
Thank you very much.
And we'll be right back after this short break with Liberty Nation Radio.
America is free. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of enterprise, and freedom is special and rare.
This is Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides, a production of LibertyNation.com, going after what the politicians really mean and making it all clear for your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
Welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio. President Biden has undergone yet another 180-degree turn as he walked back accusations that Facebook, and presumably by extension other social media channels, of killing people, with their inability to control the narratives that are naturally borne out when folks get together to discuss the goods and ills of the world. But this volte-face highlighted something important, that big tech seems happy to follow direction on what narratives they can freely allow. Now, for those of you who value the First Amendment, having voices silenced in such a virtual public square may seem a step too far. Are these digital behemoths within their rights to shut down you speaking your mind? They do, after all, own the platforms you're using. But there is a bigger question. Should government be dictating what and how people communicate among themselves? To help us cut through this morass, we're joined by Liberty Nation author James Fite to look at the serious constitutional questions. Welcome, Jim.
Thanks, Mark.
So Jim, it seems to me that the government wants to censor speech, but it has no legal right to do so. So therefore, it's reaching out to the owners of these platforms and making deals to enforce what they themselves dare not do. Is that about right?
Yeah, that seems to be pretty much the meat of it there. Imagine for a moment, well, you don't have to imagine, you're probably quite familiar with it. Imagine a nation with no First Amendment. Of course, the government wants to censor speech. If it doesn't fit the narrative, they don't want you to be saying it or hearing it. What's really concerning is, well, it's not just concerning, it's mind-boggling too, how the media, whether we're talking the traditional press or social media, like Facebook, Twitter, and so on, are so eager to have this censorship. That's what is both mind-boggling and truly scary. With such an eager social media, Facebook is happy to suppress any non-approved narratives. With such eagerness to comply, the government doesn't have to coerce them to censor people. They just, flag this as possibly problematic, which any user can flag a post. And Facebook's happy to trot right on along and delete things.
But of course, the White House bears a little more weight when it says that this post is problematic, I'm sure. Now,
of course.
White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki, she said that the administration is reaching out to, and I use the air quotes here, influencers and folks with large audiences on social media platforms to get their message across. Now, to me, this seems like state-sponsored messaging, or as we like to call it in the old world over here, propaganda. Your thoughts, Jim?
It is propaganda. And you have a hard time saying, oh, well, this specifically violates the First Amendment, for the same reason that you'd have a hard time saying that public safety announcement you heard on the radio about wearing your seatbelt was a violation of the First Amendment. Obviously, that comes from the state. I mean, it says so at the end of the commercial, it's sponsored by whatever highway and safety agency or something. This is nothing new. Television and radio, we've heard state-sponsored propaganda for years. This is just, I guess, the natural evolution of that.
You wrote recently about another event that smacks of government interference or intervention with businesses, the matter of Chick-fil-A, and how Democrat lawmakers from New York, that they're attempting to shut the fast food giant out of presumably profitable locations because of the beliefs of the company founder and their donations to Christian organizations. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. So Chick-fil-A, that story is actually not that story specifically, but the story of Chick-fil-A in general versus the left is actually kind of funny, because this is by far not the first controversy where the left is focused their ire on Chick-fil-A, and yet Chick-fil-A is, for the seventh year in a row, the number one rated fast food brand in the country. So for all that they try to destroy them, they can't. The Thruway Authority in New York, state of New York, is revamping the service stations and rest stations along I-90. And Chick-fil-A is one of the companies that was going to be allowed to open locations at these rest stops. So there are 3 Democrats, state legislators in New York, who don't want this to happen. And so they're not fighting this legislatively. They're doing, they're taking kind of the same tactic that the White House is with these problematic posts, so to speak. They've signed a petition. So they've started a petition to have the authority drop them from the program. So again, they're not making laws to edge out these companies based on ideological beliefs, but they're certainly throwing their weight around as politicians.
And again, we see that weight far exceeds that of the normal person. Jim, I'm reminded somewhat sadly of how Mussolini described his political doctrine, fascism. He said, all within the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. Now, with speech and business opportunities being restricted via the corporations and governmental bodies working in concert, would you say that perhaps there's a burgeoning shadow of this descriptor afoot in the United States?
It's certainly along the same lines in spirit, if not, letter of the law, so to speak.
That is the shortest answer. Jim, this use of the private sector for the public sector, or at least the Biden administration's benefit, seems a very clever trick. Can you give us a breakdown on how it all works?
So the First Amendment originally only applied against the federal government, and not just the federal government in general, but Congress specifically. It was only over the years as the courts reinterpreted the rule as applied to new situations that protection was expanded to eventually to the point where now, it counts even against state schools. So right now there's never been examined this whole a politician saying, I sure do wish they didn't say that. And then a private publisher saying, oh, you know what, you're right. Let's just cancel that. So at the moment, it's a very clever workaround for the First Amendment. Now, does it violate the spirit of the First Amendment? Sure. But of course, with the law, you have to violate the letter of the law unless and until the courts rule otherwise. And that's where we're kind of in murky waters here with this. That's where things may change eventually. But unless there is a ruling that specifically says, hey, this is clearly a violation of the First Amendment, then it isn't.
Okay, Jim, there is one other topic that I wanted to address that so far seems somewhat shrouded in mystery. Jen Psaki mentioned something about this. She said that there are going to be COVID-19 community courts. Now, try as I might, I haven't found much about these. What have you found out?
Absolutely nothing on the one that she says the Biden administration has created, which is worrisome. What I did find is Rice University in Texas has a COVID-19 community court. It's the only COVID-19 community court I can find any reference to on the internet whatsoever, other than direct quotes from the press secretary. And how that works is, I believe, the university has this court that's judged by, I think it's 11 students, and they receive anonymous tips. And when the semester began at Rice, all the incoming students had to sign an agreement that they were going to abide by these new COVID-19 rules. And anyone who's caught ignoring these rules, social distancing, not going to other people's dorms, etc., they come before this student-led court. And there are actual real consequences. They're not explicitly laid out, but you can be forced to go and have counseling with an advisor. Presumably, if you continue to flaunt these new rules, you could be ousted from the college.
That seems mildly concerning, Jim. All right, Jim, I want to thank you very much for being here, and thank you for listening. We'll be right back after this short break.
For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
And we're fortunate enough to be joined by Mr. Scott D.Cosenza, legal affairs editor for LibertyNation.com and host of the Uprising podcast, which I recommend to you all. Welcome, Scott.
Cheers, Mark. Thank you.
So we're going to be discussing talking liberty, everything that's affecting your freedom, your rights, and the government that seems determined to trample on them. So, Scott, the first story I really want to discuss today is what's happening in Michigan with Governor Gretchen Whitmer. Now, I read that out of the 18 gentlemen who have been sequestered by the police for their part in attempting to plot a kidnapping of the governor, turns out 12 of them were FBI informants or paid by the FBI. Could you tell us a bit more?
We have a tradition in this country of the FBI kind of manufacturing crime so that they can come out and enjoy favorable publicity when they bust people for this came, I think, to the fore most prominently in the wake of the September 11th attacks, when there was an insufficient quantity of terrorism to support the public's desire to read about how FBI was going to, bust all these terrorists. And so what they would do is they'd get a mentally diminished person off some forum who was, screaming about government and, jihad, and supply them with fake bombs and then arrest them for bombing things. Meanwhile, typically they wouldn't have had the access to or the wherewithal to go through with it themselves. And that's what we seem to have with the Whitmer kidnapping. And I'm using air quotes for people who are not watching the program.
I'm sure this is an old-fashioned legal term, but to me it sounds like entrapment.
Well, that's what the defendants are going to argue. And so for people who don't know, some of the things that the FBI agents did were they rented hotel rooms and provided refreshments and made it basically an easy path for the non-FBI agents to kind of get involved. And that's sort of akin to or one of the many layers of the case that will be made for entrapment. Another one is that they taught the non-FBI agents tactics, military tactics. The
minority, you mean, yes.
Yes. Supplied them or promised to supply them with arms and explosives, I think. So if you take away the FBI participation in the crime and then there's no crime, well, that sort of you have to think that that's some sort of entrapment at this point, I think.
I believe that a similar thing happened again in Michigan with another supposed militia group in 2012 who from what I read, they plotted to kidnap and kill a police officer, and the defense argued that they were entrapped because the idea was almost whole cloth from the FBI. And
Mark, the sad thing is you don't have to reach too far to find all kinds of stories about this. It's probably not an everyday thing, but it may be an every month or several times a year anyway. The FBI is in crisis and has been for some time. And this isn't the kind of thing I think that most people think the FBI are doing, which is helping to manufacture a crime that would not exist without their participation.
Well, according to Tom Cruise in Minority Report, they could well commit crimes in the future, and therefore the FBI would be justified in taking action now in a safe and disposable manner, I'm sure. Now, Scott, another one that's come to my attention this week in the realms of liberty and liberty restricting. New Mexico, the Supreme Court has ruled that gas stations can be liable for DUIs. Care to tell us a bit more about that?
How did it come to your attention, Mark?
You sent it to me, Scott.
Okay. This is a story that I think has broad ramifications beyond the obvious. What has happened is that, and this happens from time to time, that federal courts will ask a state court for clarification on a state law in a federal case. So if you're in the federal courts, the federal court doesn't have, they say that there's no federal common law is how this is described. Now, I have some issues with that description, which I'll leave on the table for our 3-hour-long in-depth common law broadcast, and just say that what this means is that in New Mexico, if a gas station sells gas to a person who's driving while intoxicated or obviously drunk, they are now legally liable for selling for that. So if the guy crashes into somebody, the person who was crashed into can sue the gas station. We have in this country, Mark, for a while had social or commercial host liability laws. So if somebody's over your house and it's their 21st birthday and you ply them with 21 shots and they get into an accident later, you may be liable for that. And certainly at bars, if somebody is obviously hammered, slurring their words, can barely sign the receipt for the drinks they bought, that sort of thing, it's incumbent upon them to not continue to serve someone who is obviously intoxicated. Those are the host liability laws. But never in a million years was it contemplated, I think, maybe except for some plaintiff's bar dream, that if you sold that person gasoline to further their trip, that they were somehow liable. Now, here's where this comes, I think, it's just staggering in its implications, Mark. in most of the United States, I think New Jersey and maybe Oregon are the exceptions. We don't have the notion of the guy who pumps your gas and checks the air in your tires and your oil like it used to be is gone. These are self-service pumps. People pull up, they put their credit card into the machine, and they pump their own gas. Those might be illegal now in New Mexico, because how can you judge whether or not the person you are dispensing gas to for a fee is intoxicated or not? If you have a duty to not give gas to somebody who is intoxicated, isn't that the natural implication of this?
Yeah, it seems to me that they would have to run an inspection of health on each customer as they come in to avoid liability. Now, this actually brings to mind, just while you're talking, the proposed gun regulations coming out of New York that would allow citizens or indeed the state to sue manufacturers and distributors, whether they're in New York State or not, for any accidents or crimes that happen with those guns. Now, by putting the onus on the person who's supplying, it seems to me a little more than coincidental that two such laws, one that's out and out for gun violence, I guess, and the other for gasoline, that they're coming out at the same time. Because I haven't heard anything for this for many years on these two topics.
Let me say this. Yeah. The New Mexico issue with the gasoline was an order by the New Mexico Supreme Court, and the New York State issue was passed into law by the Assembly and signed by the governor. Here's how much worse the New York State issue is. First of all, there's no constitutional right, named constitutional right to keep and bear gasoline like there is arms. But in addition to that, in the New Mexico case, it wouldn't even just be the gas station itself. It would be the transporter, the trucking company that moved the gas from point A to point B, the pipeline owner, and the refiner. In other words, that's how broad the New York restriction or grant of liability for any kind of misdeed with a firearm goes. They're both horrendous in terms of their application and their kind of outcome for liberty.
And bringing us on to possibly the most important constitutional issue of our day, the regulations that stopped Americans having a good shower brought in by Donald Trump is now being reversed by President Joe Biden. Care to enlighten us on this deep, deep constitutional issue, Scott?
You know, it's one of these things that it really impacts people, hopefully every day as they shower or bathe. In the 1990s, we had some do-good the Energy Policy and Conservation Act, which was made into law in 1992, and it made all these showerhead manufacturers put these restrictor plates in their showerhead so that it would use less water. Now, of course, if it's less water, you probably take a shower for a longer amount of time. So I don't know how much the bonus is, but also it makes you not be able to take a nice shower with a lot of water pressure kind of blasting you. It's one of the simple pleasures of life, I think, is to take a nice hot shower. And it really takes that away. Donald Trump, in his great wisdom, one of the many small things that he did that's actually a big thing is he took away that mandate that showerhead manufacturers restrict the water flow. Well, Joe Biden's putting it back.
Bringing it back.
So he's bringing bad showers back. Yes, that's exactly right.
Well, that will be at least the one enduring legacy of the Biden presidency that we can count on. Mr. Scott D.Cosenza, I want to thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, and I hope it's not too abiding.
Let's hope so.
Cheers, Mark.
And sadly, that's all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio on the Radio America Network. I want to thank our guests, Andrew Moran, Jeff Charles, James Fite, and Scott D.Cosenza for joining us on the show. But most of all, I want to thank you, the faithful listener who makes it all worthwhile. You can join us again next week, same place, same time, as always, for another grand episode where we'll be digging deep into the iniquity and insidiousness that so pervades the political landscape and examining how each and every day is a battle to maintain the freedoms afforded to you by the United States Constitution. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. Thank you again for watching this show. Until next time, I wish you all the liberty, all the happiness, and all the drive to pursue the fundamentals of freedom. Because at the end of every very, very long day, freedom is all we really truly have.